Well, okay, I got 1 o'clock. I'm Scott Nelson. I'm the research agronomist for Northwest Iowa, and I want to thank you so much for attending our webinar. In the time that I have, or that we have, we're going to talk about profitability across the landscape and understanding of where and where you're not making money on your farms. Then we've got a research update from Tony Seaman, who's going to tell a nice story about farmers and water quality. And then make sure you stay on till the end, because I've got some plot results at the end I'm going to show you that are kind of first reports and very interesting. Our first speaker is Steve Kilpack. He's been with us as an ISA member, farmer, participant for us for several years. And he's got some interesting innovations and things that he's done with his own farm. Now, one thing we like to do at the Center for Farming Innovation is help farmers with their innovations. And that's this is one example of where we're trying to help a farmer out with their innovation. We're not promoting his business as much as the concepts behind what he's doing. So with that, oh, and I should mention, on your screen, there is a chat box, and there's a place for questions and answers. And as you have questions or comments, please post them, and then we'll deal with them at the end of each talk. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Steve.
All right, thanks, Scott. That's showing up for everybody.
I can see it.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Like Scott said, my name is Steve Kilpack. I'm a farmer in western Iowa, near Beebytown, Iowa, tiny little town about 25 miles northeast of Omaha, Council Bluffs. Fifth generation family farm, and really started to dive into what we were doing on our farm and trying to understand this question: does my farm data have any value? And we felt like it really did have a lot of value, and we wanted to dive into it, but we knew there were a lot of challenges associated with that. So that was part of what we wanted to address and what I want to share with you today. So there's a picture of me, if the slide advanced. We had a little trouble in the first session. So I'm a consultant and agronomist, taught at the local community college for a number of years, don't currently do that any longer. A dreamer and a farmer. We do a lot of different things on our farming operation, from strip cropping corn and soybeans to maximize photosynthetic capacity and yield, to about 250 acres of subsurface drip irrigation. So that's our farm is really just a big testing ground for a lot of the things that we do and what we advocate for other growers. And we also work with about 250,000 acres in a variety of different ways, from fertility recommendations to seeding recommendations. And we've really learned a lot about what's going on in our fields, and we wanted to be able to share that with you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our innovations. So just a little bit more about me. We farm about 1,400 acres. That's varied depending on what we might be cash renting to someone else, or if we've cash rented anything. And we do a variety of unique practices. And we also raise some Mangalitsa hogs, do a few different niche type things with vegetables. And we really focus on trying to add and enhance to the profitability of our operation. Now, my dad has a degree in fisheries and wildlife biology, so he's an environmentalist at heart. So one of the most important things on our farm is to always be stewards of the land. But when I started farming and I went back to that question of, does our data have value, I really struggled to find tools and resources that would help me achieve the goals that I wanted. And with my farmer hat on, what I wanted to do was be able to make decisions, drive understanding, and help me become more profitable. And I feel like when I have conversations with other farmers, that's really what we're all looking for. And that's really important. And I think part of the struggle today has been that there's a lot of misinformation about your information. And it's kind of this daunting task to think about all the different things that maybe we should or shouldn't be doing with our data. And I just wanted to run through a few of the things that I've heard in the last few months and over the last several years about data coming from your farm and what you should or shouldn't be doing. But one of the false statements or one of the misinformations, and I don't think any of these are 100% false, but they have a little misdirection or a little misguidance, is that you need 10 years of yield data before you can start making decisions. And that's just not true. 1 year of data can really start to make more profitable decisions on your operation. Another statement that we often hear is you should base all of your fertility decisions on soil samples. And we just don't agree with that. And one of the statements that I always ask farmers, or questions that I ask farmers, do your yield maps look like your soil maps? And if they don't, I would look for a more complete data set. Soil samples help us to really understand the odds of economic response, but they're not the most complete tool. I think it's a combination of those factors. Another piece of misinformation is that variable rate seeding rarely pays. And in our experience, what we call seeding optimization will pay you back in seed savings from 10 to 30% of your current seeding rates. And we really don't look at your seed investment as an agronomic driving or influencing yields. We really look at it as understanding how many plants per acre or how many seeds should I place into an area to maximize the yield in that area. And we'll get into that. The only way to capture soil pH data is through soil sampling, and soil pH is one of the biggest variables that we see on growers' farms and fields and in our own fields. When we started digging into this and really trying to understand areas where we couldn't decipher why the yield was the way that it was, we would find pH levels from 4.5 up to 8.5 in our farms, and we see that across all kinds of growers' fields. When we would look at just soil sampling data, we were missing a lot of the picture. So we really recommend farmers to look at purchasing handheld pH probes. There's a lot of different ones on the market where you can go out and just take as many pH samples as you want to, focus in on an area that's yielding really well and one that isn't yielding so well, and see what the difference is. Or there's machines like the Veris MSP3, which will take up to 10 pH readings per acre. And soil pH is often as variable in a single acre as it is within an entire field. So if we look at how do we manage and drive more profitability, soil pH is one of the biggest factors that we need to look at. Another piece of misinformation that I often hear is my equipment isn't that accurate to apply cedar fertility that way, so I'm just not going to do it. And even though there are limitations with certain fertilization equipment, the reality is we can rapidly change rates on seed and fertility within every acre. Eventually, we'll get to the point where we're literally farming by the foot. But even if we think about some of the truths behind this argument, an 80-foot spreader can make almost 3 rate changes in an acre. So if you're thinking about the accuracy at which you want to apply your fertility or your seed, we can do a lot with the technology that we have today. And I believe that the technology is only going to get better. And probably one of the biggest things that we hear out in the industry right now is that big data will help you make better decisions about your farm. And that big data is the answer to unlocking more yield. And the truth is, big data will help you identify the starting points to operate within. It gives you the road ditches and the framework to make good, sound agronomic decisions, but your data will help you implement big changes to help you become more profitable. Your data is really the key to unlocking what you are doing on your farm and really understanding the profitability within every acre of your field. And here's how we go about integrating this on our own farm and with our customers. So it really all starts with looking at field level profitability. And this report is a report that's derived from our software platform that we developed. When I sat back and looked at the challenges that I had trying to manage the data on our own farm and for other customers, it took a lot of time, and it was very, very aggravating for me to have to sit in front of a computer when I really wanted to be out doing a lot of things. So we created a software platform that's a drag and drop. It's automated, and it does the heavy lifting for you. So it has very little user interaction. And this was one of my main goals that I wanted to achieve with that software. I wanted to be able to look at my fields and understand, based on my practices, where I was making money and where I was losing money. So I always ask these 4 questions of growers, and I think we should all ask this of ourselves every year. Do you feel like you are maximizing your profitability on every acre? Do you feel like you are as efficient as you could be with your inputs? Do you know where you are making money and losing money in your fields? And would you change anything about your current farming practices to help you become more profitable? And I would hope that we would all look at this information and say, yeah, there's some things that I probably need to be doing. Can you afford to have, in this example, on this particular field, there's almost 12 acres where we're losing over $250 an acre. And while we may never completely correct that loss, we might be able to change it by $50 or $100, and that just makes your break even lower. So this was really the effort that we went through on our farm to understand where we were making money and losing money, and then start making the decisions about what's really going to change our profitability. So when we think about yield maps, yield maps are oftentimes placed on a shelf in the back corner of an office, and they only get looked at the day you see them or the day you get done harvesting a field, and they really historically haven't provided a lot of value. So that was one of our big objectives, was to really deliver value through yield mapping and the data that you are collecting on your farm. So this is our yield map report, but instead of just being a yield map, it's also giving you break-even information. So you can see the input cost below and the break-even price in the top left, and what that break-even looks like. And then how can we better understand soil characteristics which influence our yield? And that's what a yield map really helps us understand. The highest yielding areas all have similar soil characteristics. Soil texture has good drainage and good water holding capacity. Soil pH is balanced, and soil organic matter is typically higher. And the lowest yielding areas all have similar characteristics. Soil texture has poor drainage or excessive drainage, and limited water holding capacity, either too much clay or too much sand. And the soil pH is usually out of balance, either too high or too low. And soil organic matter is typically lower. So when we look at these different profitability levels and we think about areas where we are losing money, there are a few practices that we can incorporate. So if we highlight this area and we say, what are a few practices that would help you become more profitable? One of the first things that we look at is managing our plant populations. So typically we're going to be looking at lower seeding rates. And we have a formula that doesn't guess at what the seeding rate should be. It's a calculated mathematical equation to predict what the seeding rate should be. The next piece is to optimize your fertility to maximize yield and profitability. Typically, that means we're going to apply lower rates of phosphorus and potassium, because historically in those lowest yielding areas, they've been over-fertilized. And then we're going to manage nitrogen inputs for maximum profitability and environmental integrity. Typically, that means in the lowest yielding areas, we're going to increase nitrogen rates. If you think back to what a yield map tells us about soil characteristics, usually the lowest performing areas have the lowest organic matter, which means they mineralize less.
Hey, before you go on, we have a question. What gives you confidence in the map that you're making?
If the question I'm speculating is relating to the accuracy of the yield data, meaning is if my yield monitor is not calibrated or calibrated, what gives us confidence in that? In all of the years that I've worked with yield monitor data, a yield monitor does one thing very, very well. it maps spatial variability. The numbers that are assigned to that in terms of yield may be 5, 10, 20% off, but they're usually fairly relative in terms of what it is telling you from a spatial variability standpoint. So that gives me a tremendous amount of confidence to say, this is a good map of spatial variability. And then if I want to assign any yield value to those spatial variables, I can do that. So I don't get stuck on whether the yield data was perfectly calibrated or anything like that. It's, did it do a good job mapping areas that are not performing as well and areas that are performing really well? And in all the years I've been around yield monitors, it does a great job of that. I hope that answers the question.
Okay.
So a few practices that we would look at in areas where we're already making money. So areas that are already profitable, these areas, we would optimize those plant populations to maximize return on investment of every seed. Typically what that means is that the seeding rate will stay the same. We will also optimize the fertility to maximize yield and profitability, which normally means we're going to increase our phosphorus and potassium fertilization there. These are the areas that historically have been under-fertilized. And then to manage our nitrogen inputs for maximum profitability and environmental integrity, we will reduce nitrogen rates typically. And these are often areas where the organic matter is higher, and it really allows us to capture more of that mineralized nitrogen. And as you'll hear later on today, when you think about managing your nitrogen investment, some of these best producing areas are also some of the riskiest areas when it comes to nitrogen loss. So we really believe that there's an additional amount of profitability to be gained in both lower performing areas and higher performing areas on all of our fields. And we really strive to just give information that you can take a look at and start to understand what's going on in your fields. So how do we make better seeding recommendations to improve profitability? Every species on planet Earth has a carrying capacity due to the limited resources available. Whether it's mountain lions or pheasants in a field, you can only have so many of those species because that's all the environment can handle. And a yield map does a tremendous job in telling us what is our carrying capacity. I always argued that if we were planting the same rate and we were applying the same amount of fertilizer across a field, that our yield should be the same across a field. And we all know that's not true. There's variability within all of our fields. And what we are actually seeing is the difference in the carrying capacity, the soil texture, the soil pH, the water holding capacity. That's really influencing our yield above anything else. So when we sit down to make a seeding rate recommendation, especially with corn, we have come up with a way to create an ear weight. So really looking at the average yield on a per plant basis instead of a acre basis. What that allows us to do is create a prescription that targets a specific ear weight. So in this example, the average ear weight on this farm was 0.34 pounds. This was seeded at 33,000 plants per acre. And we calculated that the average seeding rate would have achieved the exact same yield if it had been planted at 28,820. So that's a savings of over 15% on your seed costs without any risk of lowering yield. And it's a mathematical calculation that lets us drive this. So we really have focused a lot on understanding seeding rate recommendations and driving better ROI on a per seed basis. And here's the seeding prescription and the associated costs that would be with that. And ideally in corn production, it would be ideal if every seed you planted produced the same amount of yield per plant. And that's what we're targeting. If we look at nitrogen, how do we make our nitrogen recommendations better and improve profitability? Well, one of the things we can do with our yield data is understand our nitrogen use efficiency. Here's an example from that same field that shows that our average in-use efficiency for 175 pounds of applied nitrogen was 0.85, which is a pretty good in-use efficiency. But you can see that it ranges from 0.71 pounds of nitrogen per bushel all the way to over 1.84 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. And what that's really telling us is that there are areas where we just aren't getting as much nitrogen for free from the soil. So understanding your in-use efficiency in corn as well as soybeans will help you derive a soil mineralization map. And it will also help us understand the environmental risks and rewards associated with our cropping systems. Oh, here's that soil mineralization map. And this was one of the goals that I really had when it came to creating our variable rate nitrogen recommendations, what we call nitrogen optimization. Really understanding how much nitrogen are we getting from the soil has proven to be a bit of a challenge. And I just thought about it like a farmer, tested things like I had always done, ran different nitrogen rates. And what I realized that really our best producing soils are giving us a tremendous amount of nitrogen and our worst producing soils are not. And historically, what I think most of us have done is where you have the highest potential yields, we automatically go put more nitrogen on. And I think that's a mistake. I think those soils are typically limited in phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients. And our porous soils, which we know typically will have lower organic matter, are oftentimes not producing enough nitrogen. So we created this soil mineralization map. This looks at corn yields. We also have soybean yields that are incorporated into this. I feel very confident that they paint a good picture of what we are getting for nitrogen mineralization. So on average, this farm is producing 144 pounds of nitrogen. And we have areas, again, that are over 200 pounds and areas that are less than 25 pounds. And so when we look at our nitrogen prescription, one of the things that we want to do with our nitrogen recommendation, we all know that nitrogen in the right place will bring us more bushels. So we have a yield target here of 227 bushels. The average nitrogen recommendation is 172 pounds, and our in-use target is 0.76. So that's our nitrogen use efficiency. And in our best yielding areas, we're running 140 pounds all the way up to our poorest yielding areas that are producing or that will require over 240 pounds of nitrogen in this example. And it's pretty easy to sit down and think about if that area that is the lowest yielding is producing, say, 130 bushel corn, and the area that is the highest yielding is producing 250 bushel corn. That entire corn plant, regardless of where it's grown, is going to take about 1.3 pounds per bushel to produce the leaves, the stalks, and the grain. So if we think about that, we know that there's a much higher demand for nitrogen than what we are actually applying. So one of the things that we have to solve for is what is the amount of extra nitrogen that we're getting. And that's what we've tried to accomplish with the nitrogen mineralization map, which ties into how we are optimizing our N rates. And I always get the argument, well, is it profitable to spend that 240 pounds of nitrogen on those poorest areas? And the answer to that is, well, it really just depends on if that soil is limited by nitrogen. If the soil is limited by nitrogen, you will have a response. If it is not, then the next step is you will go back to the levels that you are currently applying or you were applying before, and you will accept that that soil just maybe can't be repaired unless you fix the most limiting factor, which most of the time, then it becomes water. The next piece that we look at is the fertility components. Phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. How do we understand what that plant requires and what we're removing from the field? So in this field, the average yield.
Steve?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, we had another question from the audience. They wanted to know on your mineralization map, how you're estimating that and if you're accounting for nitrogen losses.
So the nitrogen mineralization map, there is a factor in the equation that will be within our platform. It's something that the grower can edit what that factor of loss is. So that goes into the calculation for the mineralization map. And again, our objective was to create tools that helped us make better decisions. It really wasn't our goal to tell everyone this is how it needs to be. Everyone has different goals, different profitability objectives, and we all live within a different framework of what we're comfortable with. So we just tried to empower everyone to have the resources to make those decisions and tweak the things that are impactful, because that's a fair question. How much loss should we account for? And it really depends on the weather. As you'll see later this afternoon, rainfall has a huge impact. Well, rainfall really also influences how much mineralization you're getting, because that's what impacts biology. If you're very dry, you're going to mineralize less than if you have more water, but you're also going to have the risk of more loss. So we try to account for that. There is a default factor that we have in the equation, but that is something that can be edited. And all of our editing is done through simple forms that just ask a series of questions, and then that alters the output. So I hope that addressed that question. Again, happy to answer any questions that come up. When we look at fertility, I mentioned soil sampling, and I was always frustrated. We did a ton of soil sampling. I always struggled to draw any conclusions as to how my soil sampling recommendations related to the yield that I was experiencing. And we've really gone to looking at crop removal, because crop removal gives me an indication of budget. And as a farmer, I need to not only look at the environmental component, but I have to look at how much money can I actually spend. And if we look at crop removals as a way to govern what we're spending, we should always have enough money to justify our fertility budget. And that was one of our goals. And the other thing that we wanted to look at is, where are you typically over fertilizing and under fertilizing? So in this example, we would have removed 77 pounds of phosphorus, and you can see the costs and all the other things that are attributed to this. But if we were to consider this from the viewpoint of, what if I just went out and flat rate spread this field? What if I didn't variable rate it and I just went and flat rate spread it? And I know there's a lot of growers that's easy, and I get it, and it's efficient, but it may not be doing us the best job in maximizing our profitability. So if we look at this map, this red, green, and purple, those are areas of over application, accurate application, and under application. So purple is everywhere where we over applied based on the crop removal of the field, to the tune of maybe 30 or 40 pounds in some of those areas we over applied. And I always have growers ask me, should I be putting more fertilizer on those porous yielding spots? And I challenge them to think about the idea that they've already tested that theory. Most of those soils have been grossly over fertilized with P and K, but they have yet to be fertilized with nitrogen, which in my opinion is typically the most yield limiting factor in those soils, unless it's water or pH. So this was a really powerful piece for me to understand how good a job am I doing on my farm. And this is a 107-acre field, and to see that I'm only accurately applying fertilizer on about 24 acres, and really it's only the fringe areas, and that I'm under applying my most profitable areas and I'm over applying in my least profitable areas, those things don't go hand in hand. So we want to make sure that we aren't negatively impacting yield in those most productive areas, which is why we've come to the conclusion that we can improve yields in those areas by making sure that our fertility is right. I often tell farmers that big crops will build bigger crops. Our best source sink relationship to extract nutrients out of the environment is to put nutrients in the right place to be extracted by crops that are actually going to utilize them. And then the last piece, and I've And I'll say this, with anything that we do or recommend, our goal is always to make sure that we validate that what we are doing is actually making us more money. So one of the things that we have in place is this projected profitability. If we implemented all of these strategies that we talked about on this field, and I know this particular field very well, and we've implemented these strategies, and the results are very similar to what we are sharing here, that we can go from a 200, little over 200 bushel average to a 227, 28 bushel average, and we can enhance our profits. And the way that we are doing that is by making sure that our seed, our nitrogen, and our fertility inputs are all in place. And I know I've been talking about corn. We have similar strategies for soybeans. We've been working very diligently to try to create a very simple mechanism to help growers be more successful. And the other piece is that we wanted to validate those prescriptions. So to me, that's one of the most important things that you should see with any data information or any data management solution that's out there. If you're using someone, you should ask them to validate that the prescription that they have prescribed is actually helping you be more profitable. And that's a service that we work with people. It doesn't matter where the prescription's coming from. We want to help people be more profitable. So just real quick, Acumen Agronomics is my company. Our mission is to deliver the ability to make good judgments and quick decisions based on agronomic analysis and customized assessments. And acumen means the ability to make good judgments and quick decisions. So if you have good business acumen or good agronomic acumen, you have a good idea of what you're talking about. Here's our website URL, https acumen.ag or www.acumen.ag. And then we developed a solution so that, a lot of the things that we're talking about is oftentimes kind of like drinking out of a fire hydrant. So we sat back and we really looked at how do we help farmers make more money. And we looked at seeding as the easiest way to do that. So we developed a website called SeedSite, and you can go to seedSite.com/corn-seed-savings and get a quick quote. It doesn't cost you anything, just a quick quote to see how much money we think we can save you on seed. With that, that is the end of my presentation. I appreciate everyone's time and attendance today. Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity to share what we've been doing on our farm and what we are passionate about sharing with growers, and look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And just so we're clear, ISA isn't endorsing, we don't endorse businesses. We were just, we wanted this presentation because there were some interesting concepts and thinking behind that. So we're going to move over to our next speaker, which is Tony Seaman, who has a tremendous story to tell for farmers. So take it away, Tony.
All right, thanks, Scott. And I'll pull this up. And so given a 2020 water monitoring update today, obviously it was a challenging year for water monitoring. The COVID pandemic didn't really get in the way so much of field sampling, being out there collecting water samples, but it definitely impacted some projects and some timelines and things like that. But we were able to get a pretty good amount of sampling in this year. And so when we think about ISA's water monitoring program, it's really grown over time into kind of a multi-scale, multifaceted approach here, where we look at a combination of large rivers, particularly, larger watersheds that have gauging stations of continuous flow. We drill down into individual tributaries where we kind of look for areas to target and implement practices. In more recent years, we've really tried to drill down and work with individual producers on specific fields, monitoring tile lines, and also any conservation practices, both edge of field practices and also any in-field management practices. Of course, any water monitoring isn't just undertaken by us. We work with partners. In particular, when we think about Northwest Iowa, the data I'm going to talk about today is primarily from the Raccoon River. And the main partner there that we've worked with since 2000 is Agriculture's Clean Water Alliance. And so you can see on the map here, we've got the North Raccoon and the South Raccoon split out. And the reason we do that is because they do behave a little differently. Particularly, you can see they straddle the Des Moines lobe landform, or at least the South Raccoon does. North Raccoon is primarily in it. All the samples and data were collected and brought back and analyzed at the ISA certified lab. So having that in-house has been a big help to keeping this rolling even during challenging times. So when we think about water and water quality, we're always thinking about the rain and precipitation being the main driver for it. I'm going to talk in long term here about the April through July timeframe. Some years we sample into August, other years we haven't. So just for consistency over the record, we're going to look specifically at April through July. But again, that's when a lot of the loss happens. That's when before the crops are really uptaking it, and the nutrients are there in the ground, vulnerable to loss. And so looking at 2020, the North Raccoon, spatially average precipitation over this area was a little under 10 inches. The Raccoon River was a little over 8.5. The South Raccoon. And then when we look at the concentrations, of course, the Raccoon River is a drinking water source. So we kind of benchmark against that 10 milligrams per liter. We averaged under that 7.6 in the north, 4.8 in the south. And then looking at the whole watershed average of loss, when we pair that with the flow information, we saw about 7.5 pounds per acre of nitrate leaving the North Raccoon River and only 2.3 pounds in the South Raccoon. And those loss rates are on the low side, but it's also important to remember that that is for the entire watershed. And so when we think about what's being lost from farm fields, it's going to be higher than that because that also counts parks, ditches, roads, yards, and all those things. And so taking the longer view here, this is the same spatially average precipitation from the Iowa State Mesonet, looking at the watersheds, and you can see that 2020 was pretty extraordinary. It does line up with the drought years that we kind of think of in recent times of 2000 and 2012, actually a little lower than those. And then we can see we had some exceptional years there in the 2008 to 2010 were very wet. I'm sure we all remember. And we see a little bit of correlation between that and the concentration maps, mostly in that we see really low concentrations during the drought years. And then during those really high precipitation years where we have a lot of rainfall, we see somewhat lower than when we're in that average rain. And so we can see here one of the lower years in recent times. As usual, the North Raccoon average is higher than the South Raccoon as far as the concentration. Again, kind of a factor of all the tile drainage, the rich soils, and intense crop production. The South Raccoon a little hillier, a little more pasture, and less tile. But then when we get here to the nitrate yield, we see a lot of correlation with what we see in the precipitation, and that we see real low loss in those dry years. Again, under 5 pounds per acre back in 2000, 2012. 2020, again, we saw about 7.5 in the North Raccoon, very low. But what I want to look at here is when we think back to 2012 and when we're thinking about a drought year, look at 2013. And when we got all that rain, just because we didn't have a lot of loss of nitrogen through the rivers this year, we know that's driven by precipitation. And so it's not like that nitrogen necessarily went out with the crop or magically disappeared. Chances are pretty good that it's going to be still sitting there in the soil. It was, the mineralization still happened. It just wasn't mobilized enough for uptake into the crop or to be leached down. And so I see this as kind of an opportunity, and I'll talk about it a little farther, but the fact that nitrogen's still out there on the landscape is something we should keep in mind going forward. When we think about the tributaries then, and as we drill down, this map isn't the best map from this year, but it's hot off the press, so I thought I'd show it. This includes August, and so obviously August was very low this year. And so that kind of drew all the concentrations down and put them in the range. Down in the lower part of the watershed, we missed some samples due to the derecho. And so those colored gray, we didn't really get the the sampling to complete this out. But a couple things, we still had 5 sites that were above 10 milligram per liter average when we just look at that April to July time period. And then we had 4 that were below 5. And those low ones typically are going to be in the South Raccoon there. Again, probably less intensively row cropped. You may notice up there around Storm Lake, the high concentration there, and that's kind of a well-known point source. There's some treatment plants that discharge there below the lake, and so that one typically acts the opposite of the rest of the North Raccoon, where when we have dry years, the concentrations really shoot up from that, and when it's really wet, you don't really see it. And so when we use a targeting map like this, I'll go ahead and zero in. This is Elk Run, where we've had a project going for a few years. And so we can look at when we go into an area like this. So first looking at 2020, this is the typical pattern we see in row crop Iowa streams. We see elevated concentrations in April, May, usually peaking sometime in June. And then as we get a lot of uptake, the water slows down, the temperature warms up, we get less leaching, we have more production in the stream where that nitrate is being used up for algae and other plant growth, and then kind of bottoming out there at the end of the year as things really slow down. And when we're working in an area, again, we can look at the tributaries and we'll kind of section out. This watershed had some sampling on these streams. And then again, this gives us an idea of where we should be targeting resources, where the biggest opportunities are to make some improvements. And in this particular watershed there, that site to the east on the right there, ER1, you see is the lowest. There's a fair amount of pasture there. So obviously we're not looking to implement a lot of infield practices in pastures. We're going to look more and target those areas to the south and farther to the west. And in particular, with this watershed, it's been on our radar for a while. There's a reason that we did work there. You can see here through the early 2000s, we were having individual measured concentrations above 20 and in some cases over 30 milligrams per liter. So 2 to 3 times the drinking water standard we're kind of thinking about in the Raccoon down here at the mouth. And so we were wanting to do some work here. And then looking at this long-term record, when we get to 2008, 2009, 2010, we see kind of things come down a little bit. Again, those were those high flushing years. If we think about this, the water coming out of the tile and the nitrogen in it, it's obviously in the soil. And then once it gets down into the groundwater, that's another pool that the tiles are drawn out of. And so that can be kind of flushed and really take a lot of the nitrogen out for a short time. When we hit 2011 and 2012, those drought years really dropped off and we see concentrations low. And then once we hit 2013, oh boy, we saw some high concentrations up over 50, 60, pushing 70 milligrams per liter on some samples. And again, this kind of shows that even though we weren't losing anything while there wasn't a lot of water moving through the system, that nitrogen was still there and was vulnerable to be lost. And once it gets down into that, below the root zone of the plants, then it's there to be lost and it's going to stay there. And so we see that it took, up through 2016, probably 2017 before we kind of see things get back to the levels before that. Another story about this is that some of the producers in this area, when we started having a coordinator up there and meeting with them and looking at some of the practices, there were some guys, there's a fair amount of livestock and there was quite a bit of manure being applied. And there were a few instances where we talked to producers who were still applying commercial at pretty high rates along with their manure. And we're seeing this show up in the tiles and in the streams where we can see that we've got a loss problem and we're probably over applying. So working with some of those producers is probably helping because we can see since this came back down after the drought, we're still kind of declining even to a level before what we saw before some of those odd weather years. And so I think that's a good sign. I won't say that mission accomplished and everything's fine up there and we've maximized minimizing loss, but I think things are pointing in the right direction. And again, I hope and can't imagine that any producer that was over applying at a high level, not taking proper manure credits, didn't make a little money out of changing those rates. So the tile sampling in the Raccoon here, we've got some samples, 78 sites spread around the watershed here. just kind of looking at both the north and the south. Again, these are going to average a little higher because of groundwater. So we saw the average of all of them was 11.8. We had 6 of them that averaged above 20. And while that wasn't particularly high for what we see from year to year, that was a little bit high this year. And then 32 were below the 10 milligram per liter drinking water limit. And so when we kind of spread this out and group them, again, we see kind of that typical pattern of elevated concentrations in April, May. We usually are peaking and seeing the majority of our loss there in June before the crops are really starting to grab all that. We're still getting a lot of rain. The landscape's fairly uncovered, so water's moving through the soil. Then we get to July, and then it starts to come back down in August. And now you'll notice again that this doesn't really drop quite as much as the stream did. And the tile water is groundwater, and so that pool is not really subject to as much of the biological activity that we see in the streams. But that's also probably a little bit elevated to what we would see, because kind of the real story here was how many tiles dried up. And so this is just kind of a categorical analysis. So this isn't exclusively samples that weren't collected because it was dry, but the vast majority of them are. There's maybe a few where we couldn't access it, but you can see the difference in getting 80 to 90% of the samples when we're out there in the field. We hit July, it's about half the tiles are dry, and we get to August, barely any. And then at September, we had so few and so little had changed that we kind of just cut off sampling, and we didn't really even go out. Thought we would kind of bide some time and wait and see when the rains came, and we could start to look at if we're going to see that spike that we may expect with all that nitrogen sitting in the landscape, and we're still waiting. And then just looking spatially here, again, this isn't necessarily apples to apples because these samples weren't all necessarily collected the same days, and this is a simple average. So if a tile dried up and we only got a sample in June, then it's going to show up higher than one that we sampled throughout. But you can see that looking at the landscape here, we have varying concentrations around. So again, while these fields are different, the effect of the landform we know is there. We also can see that management and how we're treating the land does matter, because we can see one site that's pretty high and in the same area as sites that are low. And so when we're thinking about the opportunity that all this nitrogen that didn't get lost through the rivers this year, one of the conservation practices we can look at would be cover crops, especially if a wet spring here, if we get some rains, if we could get some good growth, the idea being that those cover crops get some good growth, would scavenge some of that nitrogen that's still in the upper part of the root zone and put that into biomass available later in the year when it dies off. We haven't got the management information all in and compiled yet for 2020. And unfortunately, we haven't really been doing some of this in-depth tile monitoring with the management information long enough to have data from the last drought and kind of those high concentrations afterwards. But we do see in general, we consistently see fields that are lower in cover crops having a lower concentration. Even if you consider the water balance may be slightly different, lower concentrations typically going to mean lower loss. And so this is something that we've seen for several years now, and would seem to suggest that it would keep that nitrogen in place. So the conclusions, quickly, nitrogen loss was obviously low in 2020. And in fact, when we cut this off in July and August, the drought was really not even into full swing yet. It has continued to persist. So that, again, means there's nitrogen that didn't get taken up and harvested off with the crop, and it didn't get lost through the river. So what's it at? Where's it at? Well, it's still out there on the landscape. And so that residual nitrate could present an opportunity. Obviously, as we saw in 2013, if we get a wet spring, warm, a lot of rain before we can get plants in the ground, we don't have cover crops down, there's not going to be a lot we can do, but it might be an opportunity where we could reduce some rates or look at some later application timing. Perhaps a tool like some soil nitrate testing could be of value here to see what's already out there and think about what's in the soil, what's going to come available in the soil before we necessarily apply the usual amount more. And then finally, cover crops should help capture that, and we'll be obviously collecting data and looking into that here if we see the expected spike in concentrations that we think we're going to see. So with that, I will give it back to Scott.
Thank you, Tony. And we may run over just about 5 minutes. I've got some interesting data I want to share with you. And we don't have all of our plot data together yet, but I wanted to go over results from 2 trials because I think they might be interesting to you. So this is a trial. We're interested in understanding the yield loss for corn, falling, cereal, rye cover crops. Tony mentioned about the benefits of cover crops in sequestering nitrogen. And so we were interested in finding ways that we can increase yield in corn, fallen cover crops like cereal rye. And as you know, many producers fear doing that because of potential yield loss. Now, this is a plot we did up by Clarion, and there's actually corn seedlings in there. This corn was planted green. It was such a cool spring at this time that it was the cereal rye didn't die for a long time afterwards. I was kind of mad about this plot, but it provided some interesting information because I thought there was no way I figured this plot was lost when I evaluated it in the spring. I want to go over some of the treatments in this trial. We had a no cover crop comparison, and that was 150 pounds of nitrogen applied in the fall. And I should say our hypothesis is that we don't need more nitrogen in corn, fallen cover crops, but we do need to manage it differently. And it doesn't need to be more complicated. It just needs to be managed differently. So that was our hypothesis. So these treatments as I mentioned, we had no cover crop comparison. We had a cover crop comparison with 150 pounds of ammonia in the fall. We had a cover crop comparison with 150 pounds of ammonia in the spring. And then we had different treatments where we were trying to apply nitrate available forms of nitrogen to overcome the mineralization that occurs with heavy residue. So we had 100 pounds of fallen anhydrous with a high rate of starter, UAN, in treatment 4. Treatment 5, we had spring anhydrous ammonia with 50 pounds of N as an early side dress. That would be about V2, V4. And then we had a different starter formulation with sulfur. And then we had 2 comparisons of broadcast urea at 50. We used a blend of stabilized urea with AMS at 50 pounds and 100 pounds of N per acre, and that was equivalent to, and it gave 20 pounds of sulfur in the trial. So I'm going to show you the yield results now from this trial, and I know a lot of you are probably thinking that there was a total loss, but on this trial, you can see that the early season nitrogen treatments, the treatment control 1, was the lowest yielding in this plot. Cover crop with fall anhydrous was a little bit higher yielding, and then treatment 3, cover crop with spring anhydrous, was a little higher yielding. What I want you to notice, the highest yielding plot in this was with 50 pounds of nitrogen applied as starter with cover crop. The second highest treatment was treatment 8, where it was a blend of urea and ammonia sulfate broadcast over the top right after planting. And this is significant because some farmers don't want to mess with starter. They don't want to slow down too much in the spring. And so being able to apply a blend of stabilized urea with ammonia sulfate right after planting is a very convenient management practice. And you can see they were statistically the same. The other treatments of side dress nitrogen early also showed a yield advantage, but they were slightly lower yielding than the 2 top treatments, but they were significantly better than the no cover crop standard. So in summary, I put 40, but there's a 20 bushel advantage to cover crops if the nitrogen was managed differently with optimum N management. And so we conclude from our hypothesis that yes, cover crops can yield, corn, fallen cover crops can yield more than no cover crops, provided that your management system is different. Now your mileage may differ in your fields. This is a one year study. We're going to repeat it next year. I did want to go over a few on-farm trials doing the same thing that we saw in 2020. And in these on-farm trials, we had a no-till corn, a cereal rye cover crop, but it was a light stand in these fields. And this is from 2 fields near Boone, Iowa. And the treatments in this trial was the farmer standard was 100 pounds of fall applied ammonia, followed by a V6 application of ammonia of about 75 pounds. The other application, the suggested improved practice, was 100 pounds of nitrogen as fall anhydrous, followed by pre-plant stabilized urea with ammonia sulfate. Here's a visual difference of the plants early, and you can see the improved is on the left and the standard practice is on the right. Now, we don't know that this is from if this response was due to sulfur or was due to more nitrogen availability. We took soil tests or tissue test samples, and we found that the sulfur was about equivalent in the two plots, but tissue testing has its anomalies, and it's difficult to really know using tissue testing. Here's the yields for this trial, and you can see the standard on the left, a V6 application of ammonia yielded 168 bushels, but pre-plant N, stabilized urea with AMS got us up to 180 bushels. This farmer had a second field, and you can see at V6, he was at 166 bushels, and at pre-plant, he gained 10 bushels. So there was a 10 to 14 bushel yield advantage for using stabilized urea with ammonia sulfate applied pre. So this adds more evidence to our theory that having nitrate available nitrogen during the early yield formation stages of corn is very important in corn following cover crops. So what our recommendation, now this is based upon 1 year and we've got to repeat, but we believe that 40 to 50% of your total nitrogen should be as a nitrate form soon after planting. You can culture inject that UAN, you can apply starter, or you can do a blend of stabilized urea with AMS. A lot of farmers like to do broadcast UAN, but I'm afraid that's less stable, but we don't have any data on that, and we'll be testing that again next year. Let me stop just a second and see if there was any questions from the audience on this. Just give me a second while I get my... Oh, I can't see the questions now. Kristen, is there any questions?
No, I don't see any other new
Okay.
ones. So if you have any questions, if you would type those in now, Scott will answer.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. This is a second study, and we're gonna do a recording of all of our yield results, but I thought this one would be very interesting to you. As you know, soybean gall midge has been a big problem in western Iowa, reducing stand counts, killing soybeans, and just being a dreadful pest reducing yield, especially along field boundaries. Well, we did some trialing this year with Thimet, and that is a soil applied insecticide. It has a label for soybeans, but it's primarily used in corn for corn rootworm. This was applied with a smart box system in furrow. And what I'm showing here is on the y-axis is number of dead plants, percent dead plants. And then you can see the two treatments, Thimet versus the untreated control. And what I want you to notice is that the amount of dead, that Thimet dramatically prevented plant loss compared to the untreated check versus gall midge. If we look at yields, you can see that the Thimet was higher yielding compared to the untreated check. So now let's talk about how you might use Thimet. And I, for one, wouldn't recommend that we applied Thimet or across the whole field. Rather, soybean gall midge tends to start at the field edges and work its way through the field. So my thinking is that a farmer would ring in an area that's affected by gall midge, would ring their field with thiamine, maybe plant it with their corn planter, plant the end rows with their corn planter with thiamine on it, and then plant the rest of the field with their standard soybean planter without thiamine. That's our working hypothesis about how to manage this pest. Now, the crop protection industry is also developing. There's some new seed treatments that I haven't seen the data. I've just been told that they are active, and there's some new foliar sprays that may be active in an integrated system. So the good news is that we have one tool for suppression of gall midge. It's maybe not for everybody, and the crop protection industry is getting smarter about figuring out how to manage those pests with other inputs. With that, I just want to conclude and thank you for being on our webinar here with an appeal. Work with us on your innovations. We're very interested in hearing your ideas for farm management. Like Steve, we're interested in helping you with your innovations. And if you want to participate in our programs, you can contact me at this address. Thank you very much for your attention today. And Kristen, is there any questions on the line? I can't see them for some reason.
No other questions. So if you have a question for Scott, if you want to type that into the chat or the Q&A section, he'll be able to answer those.
Otherwise, thank you for participating. And for some of you farmers that are in our membership, we're asking you to validate your membership. And so if you're a member of Iowa Soybeans, go to iasoybeans.com under membership. And if you would, just validate your membership. So we know that we're trying to redo our member lists, and we have people kind of like voting lists where the people have died and we don't know what's going on with them. And so we're asking people to validate. So thank you very much.